They warned him the dog had bitten 3 officers and should have been put down, but when blind veteran Ethan Cole reached out, the so-called most dangerous K9 went completely still, then slowly pressed his head into Ethan's hand, as if recognizing something no one else could see. And that same night, Rex suddenly snapped awake, dragging Ethan out of a small cabin just seconds before a gas explosion tore through the wall they'd been standing beside. And as flames lit the dark sky, Ethan whispered with shaking breath, "You heard it coming, didn't you?" But what shocked everyone wasn't the explosion. It was what Rex did next when he turned toward the burning wreckage and started pulling Ethan straight back inside. Some souls don't need eyes to see the truth, only something loyal enough to guide them. The shelter smelled faintly of disinfectant and cold metal, the kind of place where forgotten things waited quietly for time to decide their fate, and Ethan Cole stood just inside the doorway, his hand resting lightly on the frame, as if listening to the silence itself, his dark glasses hiding the absence behind his gaze, his posture calm in a way that unsettled the staff more than confidence ever could, because outside, in a reinforced enclosure at the far end of the corridor, a dog no one trusted paced in slow, deliberate circles, nails tapping against concrete like a clock counting down something no one understood. And they told him the same thing they told everyone, that the dog was unstable, that it had been trained for things most people couldn't imagine, that something had gone wrong, and now it couldn't be placed, couldn't be trusted, couldn't be touched. But Ethan didn't move away, didn't hesitate. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if hearing something beneath there. Words, something softer, something buried. And when they finally opened the gate with reluctant hands, the air shifted in a way no one could explain because the dog stopped pacing, just stopped, as if a switch had been flipped somewhere deep inside him, and for a long second the world held its breath. Then Ethan stepped forward, one careful step at a time, boots soft against the concrete, his hand extending into the space between them. Not searching, not demanding, just offering in the dog. Watched him, ears high, body still, amber eyes fixed on a man who could not see him, and yet somehow felt more seen than he had in years. And instead of the low warning growl everyone braced for, there was only a quiet shift of weight, a slow lowering of the head, until fur met skin and the room exhaled all at once, because the most dangerous dog they had ever known had just chosen stillness, had just chosen him, and Ethan's fingers curled gently into the thick coat, reading something there that no file or record had ever captured, a story written in scars and silence. And he smiled faintly, almost to himself, as if the truth had always been waiting just beneath the noise. "You're not dangerous," he said softly. "You're just tired of not being understood." And somewhere deep in the dog's chest, something uncoiled, something old and guarded, because sometimes the ones the world fears the most are simply the ones who have been listening too long for someone who finally knows how to hear. The drive back to Ethan's small cabin stretched longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because of the silence that settled between man and dog, a silence that was not empty but full of quiet observation, the kind that did not need words to exist. And as the tires hummed against the narrow country road, Ethan rested one hand lightly against Rex's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall beneath the thick coat, grounding himself in a rhythm that felt strangely familiar, like something he had known long before the war took his sight and left him with echoes instead of images. And Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, ears shifting with every passing sound, tracking the world in ways Ethan could no longer do alone, as if the space between them had already begun to close without either of them needing to ask how or why. And when they reached the cabin tucked at the edge of a quiet pine stretch just outside town, the air carried the faint scent of wood and distant water, a creek running somewhere beyond the trees, its soft movement barely audible unless you knew how to listen. And Ethan did. He always had, long before he learned to live without sight. He had learned to listen for the things most people ignored, the small shifts, the hidden signals, the quiet warnings that live beneath the surface of everyday life. And as he stepped out of the truck, Rex moved ahead of him, not pulling, not rushing, but guiding with a subtle firmness, adjusting his pace just enough so that Ethan's steps fell naturally in line, as if they had practiced this for years instead of hours. And inside the cabin, the wood floor creaked softly under their weight, the kind of sound that spoke of age but not weakness, of time passing without losing purpose. And Ethan paused just inside the doorway, tilting his head slightly as Rex circled once, twice, mapping the space with careful precision before settling near the window, where the faint breeze slipped through the frame, carrying with it a whisper of the outside world. And for a moment, nothing happened, just the quiet settling of two lives adjusting to one another, until Rex's ears twitched sharply toward the back wall, his body stiffening for a fraction of a second before relaxing again. A signal so subtle most people would have missed it entirely, but Ethan did not, because he felt it through the air itself, a shift, a tension, something unspoken, and he turned his head in that direction, not because he knew what was there, but because Rex did, and that was already becoming enough. "You hear something I do not," Ethan murmured softly, his voice calm, not questioning, just acknowledging, and Rex exhaled slowly, lowering himself to the floor, but keeping his gaze fixed toward that same unseen point, as if marking it for later, as if storing it away in a place only he understood. And the fire Ethan built crackled gently in the hearth, filling the room with a steady warmth that pushed back the chill creeping in from the evening air, and time moved quietly, almost gently, until night settled fully over the trees and the world outside became a deeper kind of silence, the kind that did not comfort everyone, but Ethan had learned to live within it, to find its edges, to understand its weight. And Rex remained awake longer than he should have, his breathing steady but his ears never fully resting, shifting at the smallest disturbances, the distant snap of a branch, the low hum of wind weaving through the pines, the faint vibration of something far beneath the ground that most would dismiss as imagination. But Rex did not dismiss anything. And sometime past midnight, when the fire had burned low and the cabin held only the soft glow of fading embers, Rex rose suddenly, not with panic, not with aggression, but with a quiet urgency that carried purpose instead of fear, and he moved toward Ethan, pressing his nose firmly against his arm, once, twice, a signal clear and deliberate, and Ethan woke instantly, his body trained by years of instinct to respond without hesitation. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, already sitting up, already listening. And for a moment there was nothing, just the steady silence of night, but Rex did not move away. Instead he turned toward the door, then back to Ethan, then to the door again, repeating the motion until it formed a pattern, a message, and Ethan stood, his bare feet finding the cool wood floor as his hand reached out until it found Rex's collar, grounding himself again in that same steady presence. And without another word, he followed, because trust, once formed in silence, does not need explanation. And as Rex guided him toward the door, the air felt different, heavier, like something unseen had shifted just beyond the walls, something waiting, something approaching, and Ethan paused only once, his hand tightening slightly as he listened deeper, beyond the obvious, beyond the surface. And though he could not name it, he felt it too now, a faint unease carried in the stillness. And beside him, Rex stood perfectly still, ears forward, body aligned towards something only he could fully perceive, as if the night itself had begun to speak, and he was the only one who could understand what it was trying to say. The night did not feel the same once the door opened, as if the quiet outside carried a different kind of weight, something older than wind and deeper than the soft rustling of pine needles. And Ethan stood at the threshold with one hand resting on a rough wooden frame, while the other held lightly to Rex's collar, grounding himself in the steady warmth of the dog beside him. And for a long second, neither of them moved, not because they were afraid, but because they were listening truly. Listening to the kind of silence that most people walk past without ever noticing, and somewhere beyond the cabin, past the thin stretch of trees and the narrow dirt path that curved toward the creek, there was a faint vibration, not a sound exactly, but something that lived beneath sound, a subtle pulse that pressed gently against the air, and Rex felt it first, his body aligning toward it with quiet certainty, his ears standing tall, as if catching a signal carried through the ground itself. and Ethan felt the shift through Rex, through the tension in the leash, through the way the dog's breathing changed just slightly. And that was enough, because sight had never been the thing he trusted most, even before he lost it. And now it was replaced by something slower, deeper, something that required patience and belief. "Show me," Ethan whispered, not as a command, but as an agreement, and Rex stepped forward, guiding him down the short wooden steps and onto the cool earth below, where the night air wrapped around them with a quiet chill that carried the scent of damp soil and distant water. And each step they took felt measured, intentional, as if the path itself was being revealed only as they moved along it. And the deeper they went, the more the world seemed to narrow into sensation, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot, the faint hum beneath the ground growing just enough to be noticed if one listened closely, and Ethan did, his head tilting slightly as if aligning himself with something invisible, something just out of reach, and Rex paused suddenly, his body still, his focus fixed on a point ahead where the trees opened slightly near the edge of the creek, and the air there felt different, heavier somehow, as if holding on to something that had not yet been released, and Ethan stepped closer, guided by the gentle pressure of Rex's movement, until his boots met the softer ground near the water's edge, and he crouched slowly, one hand extending downward until his fingers brushed against the earth, cool and slightly damp. And for a moment he said nothing, just feeling, just listening, letting the world speak in its own quiet language. And then it came again, that subtle pulse, steady, rhythmic like a distant heartbeat carried through soil and stone, and Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, not in fear, but in recognition, because there was something familiar in that pattern, something that echoed a memory buried deep within him, a time when listening had meant survival, when waiting for the smallest signal had been the difference between safety and danger. And he inhaled slowly, grounding himself in the present, reminding himself that this was not that place, not that time, but still the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. And beside him, Rex lowered his head slightly, his nose hovering just above the ground as if tracing the source of the vibration. And then, without warning, he shifted his stance, stepping back just enough to nudge Ethan gently away from that exact spot. Not forcefully, not urgently, but with a quiet insistence that carried meaning, and Ethan responded without hesitation, allowing himself to be guided a few steps back, trusting the message even without understanding it fully. And as they moved, the pulse beneath the ground seemed to soften, to fade just slightly, as if whatever had been stirring there had passed or settled, or chosen not to reveal itself any further, and the night returned to its earlier stillness, the kind that feels almost peaceful after something unseen has moved through it. And Ethan remained standing there for a long moment, his hand still resting lightly on Rex's back, feeling the steady warmth, the calm strength, the presence that had led him safely without explanation. And he exhaled slowly, a faint smile touching his lips, not because he understood what had just happened, but because he trusted the one who did. "You heard it before I could," he murmured softly, his voice carrying a quiet gratitude that needed no answer. And Rex lifted his head slightly, ears relaxing just a fraction as the tension eased from his body, but his gaze did not fully leave that spot near the creek, as if marking it in memory, as if knowing that whatever had spoken through the ground tonight was not finished, not gone, just waiting. And as they turned back toward the cabin, the trees whispered softly in the night breeze, and the world felt unchanged to anyone else who might have been watching. But for Ethan, something had shifted, something small but undeniable, because for the first time since losing his sight, he was not walking through darkness alone, and perhaps it was where the real change had begun, not in what they had found, but in the quiet certainty that they would face whatever came next together. Morning did not arrive all at once, but slipped quietly through the cracks of the cabin walls, carried in by the faint scent of pine and the distant murmur of the creek. And Ethan woke not to light, but to the subtle shift in the air, the way the silence of night loosened into something softer, something that felt less guarded. And beside him Rex was already awake, not restless, not tense, but alert in that calm, watchful way that suggested the world had layers most people never noticed, and Ethan sat up. Slowly, his hand brushing against the worn blanket before finding Rex's shoulder, grounding himself in the familiar warmth that had already begun to feel less like companionship and more like alignment, as if their rhythms were learning each other with quiet patience. And for a moment, neither of them moved, just listening, just breathing, letting the morning settle around them without hurry, until Rex shifted slightly, his ears turning toward the back of the cabin again, toward that same direction from the night before. And Ethan felt it immediately, that subtle change, not fear, not urgency, but attention, and he tilted his head, focusing not on sound alone but on the absence of it, the way certain spaces seem to hold their breath longer than others. "It is still there, isn't it?" he said softly, more statement than question, and Rex exhaled low, a quiet confirmation that did not need words. And as Ethan rose and moved toward the small kitchen, his steps were steady, guided. Now not just by memory of space, but by the quiet awareness that he was no longer navigating alone, and the kettle warmed slowly on the stove, the faint hiss of heating water blending with the gentle creak of wood and the distant whisper of wind threading through the trees outside, and everything felt ordinary, almost deceptively so, until Rex stood abruptly, not with alarm, but with purpose, and moved toward the back door again, his body aligned in that same direction, his focus unwavering. And Ethan paused mid-step, listening, feeling, sensing the shift ripple through the room like a silent signal. And without hesitation he followed, because something in him had already accepted that whatever Rex noticed first was worth understanding. And when they stepped outside, the air felt clearer than it had the night before, cooler, sharper, carrying the clean scent of water and earth. And the path toward the creek revealed itself again under their feet, each step deliberate, each movement guided by quiet trust that no longer needed explanation. And as they approached the same clearing where the ground had pulsed with that strange rhythm, Ethan slowed, crouching once more, his hand reaching toward the earth. And for a moment there was nothing, just the cool surface beneath his fingertips, steady and still. And then, faintly, it returned, softer now, but unmistakable, that same rhythmic vibration, like something far below, shifting in a pattern too consistent to be random. And Ethan's brow tightened slightly, not in fear but in thought, because patterns meant something, patterns always meant something. And beside him Rex lowered his head again, but this time he did not simply observe, he moved, stepping carefully to the side, tracing a slow arc around the area, as if mapping the edges of something invisible. And Ethan listened to those movements, to the way Rex's paws pressed into the ground, to the slight changes in pace that revealed where the sensation grew stronger or weaker, and slowly, almost without realizing it, he began to understand, not with sight, but with a kind of internal mapping shaped by trust and attention, and he shifted his position accordingly, moving a few inches at a time until the vibration beneath his hand aligned with the subtle tension in Rex's posture. And then it became clear, not in a visual sense, but in a knowing that whatever lay beneath the surface was not spread randomly, but concentrated, focused in a specific place. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers pressing just slightly deeper into the soil as if trying to read what lay below. And though he could not see it, he felt the faint warmth of movement beneath, not heat exactly, but a difference, a presence, something that did not belong entirely to still earth. And Rex stopped beside him, standing perfectly still, his gaze fixed downward, his ears angled forward in precise alignment. And for a moment the world seemed to narrow again into that shared point of focus, that single place where something unseen continued to move in its own quiet rhythm. And Ethan spoke softly, almost to himself. "You are not warning me away," he said, his voice thoughtful, measured. "You are showing me where it is." And Rex did not move, did not react, but the stillness itself felt like confirmation, like agreement. And Ethan sat back slightly, his mind turning over the possibilities, not in panic, not in fear, but in that steady, deliberate way he had learned long ago when understanding mattered more than reacting. And whatever this was, whatever lay beneath the ground near the creek, it was not random, it was not chaotic, it was patterned, deliberate, almost alive in a way that did not fit simple explanations. And the realization did not bring fear, only a deeper sense of curiosity. Because sometimes the unknown is not something to avoid, but something to approach carefully, with respect, with patience, with a willingness to listen longer than most people are comfortable with. And as Ethan rose slowly to his feet, his hand once again finding Rex's shoulder, he felt a quiet certainty settle in. Not about what they had found, but about what they would do next, because whatever was beneath that ground had not revealed itself fully. Not yet, and Rex, with his steady gaze and unspoken awareness, seemed to understand that better than anyone, as if he had already accepted that some truths do not arrive all at once, but in pieces, in signals, in quiet moments that ask only one thing in return, that someone is willing to stay long enough to listen. The ground did not speak any louder after that morning, but it did not fall silent either, and that was what stayed with Ethan as they walked back toward the cabin. The steady awareness that whatever rested beneath the soil near the creek had chosen to remain, not hidden exactly, but not fully revealed, like a presence waiting for the right moment to be understood. And as the day unfolded, the world around them carried on in its ordinary rhythm, the wind brushing through the trees, the distant hum of a passing truck miles away, the quiet creak of wood as the cabin adjusted to the warmth of the sun. But beneath it all there was something else now, a second layer of awareness that Ethan could not ignore. Because once you learn to listen beyond the surface, it becomes impossible to return to the way things were before, and Rex moved through the day with that same calm vigilance. Never restless, never anxious, but always aware, his ears shifting at the smallest changes, his body aligning subtly whenever the faint vibration returned. And Ethan noticed, not through sight, but through the patterns of movement, the way Rex would pause near the back wall, the way his breathing would slow when facing the direction of the creek, as if measuring something that no instrument could record. And by late afternoon, the decision formed not as a sudden impulse, but as a quiet certainty, the kind that grows slowly until it becomes undeniable. And Ethan stepped outside once more, the sunlight warm against his face, the air carrying the scent of dry earth and distant water, and he stood still for a moment, listening, feeling, aligning himself with the world in the only way he knew how. "We are not done with it," he said softly, his voice calm, steady, and Rex responded not with movement, but with stillness, a stillness that confirmed what Ethan already knew, and together they made their way back toward the clearing. The path now familiar beneath their feet, each step guided by memory and trust. And when they reached the spot again, Ethan did not crouch immediately, did not reach for the ground. Instead, he stood quietly, letting the space reveal itself in its own time. And after a moment, the pulse returned, faint but steady like a distant rhythm echoing through layers of earth. And this time, Ethan followed it differently, not just through touch, but through movement, stepping slowly around the area of the way Rex had done earlier, mapping the invisible edges through sensation. And with each step the pattern became clearer, the vibration stronger in some places, softer in others, forming a shape, not random, not scattered, but contained, almost circular, as if something below had boundaries. And Ethan stopped at the edge of that unseen shape, his brow tightening slightly as he processed the realization. Because patterns like this were not natural, not in the way most things were, they suggested structure, intention, something placed rather than formed. And he knelt carefully, his fingers brushing the ground again, tracing the surface as if reading a language written in texture instead of ink. And then he felt it, something different beneath his hand, not just the subtle vibration, but a slight firmness, a change in the density of the soil, as if the earth there had been disturbed at some point long ago and then settled again. And his breath slowed, his focus sharpening, because this was no longer just a sensation, this was evidence. And beside him, Rex lowered himself slightly, his nose hovering inches above that same spot, his body still, his attention unwavering. and for a moment the world seemed to narrow into that single point of connection. Man and dog aligned over something neither could see, but both could feel. And Ethan spoke quietly, almost as if thinking aloud. "This is not just movement," he said, his voice thoughtful, measured. "This is something beneath us." And Rex exhaled softly, a low sound that carried agreement rather than concern, and Ethan sat back slowly, his hand resting on his knee as his mind moved through the possibilities, not rushing, not forcing answers, but allowing them to form naturally, because whatever lay below was not revealing itself through urgency. It was revealing itself through patience, and that meant rushing would only cloud what needed to be understood clearly. And the sun began to lower behind the trees, casting longer shadows across the clearing. Though Ethan could not see them, he felt the shift in temperature, the subtle cooling of the air, the way the day began to fold into evening. And still the pulse remained steady, consistent, as if marking time in its own quiet way, and Ethan finally stood, his hand finding Rex's shoulder once more, grounding himself in that familiar presence, and he nodded slightly, not to the dog, but to the understanding forming within him, because whatever this was, whatever lay beneath the ground near the creek, it was not a threat in the way people often imagine. It was something else, something waiting to be acknowledged, to be uncovered, not through force, but through trust. And as they turned back toward the cabin once more, Ethan carried with him a quiet certainty that had not been there before, a sense that this was not coincidence, not chance, but something placed in their path for a reason. And beside him Rex walked with the same steady confidence, his steps measured, his presence unwavering, as if he had known all along that this moment would come, that this place would matter, and that together they would be the ones to listen when no one else could, because sometimes the truth does not shout to be heard. It waits patiently beneath the surface, trusting that someone will come who knows how to listen long enough to find it. That evening settled differently than the ones before it. Not because anything obvious had changed, but because Ethan could feel the weight of knowing pressing gently against the edges of his thoughts, the kind of knowing that does not arrive as answers, but as a quiet pull towards something unfinished. And inside the cabin the fire burned low, casting a steady warmth that softened the cool air drifting in through the walls. And Rex lay near the doorway, not asleep, not fully at rest, but in that careful stillness that had become his way of watching without drawing attention, his ears shifting now and then toward the direction of the creek, as if the space itself continued to speak in a language only he fully understood. And Ethan sat in the old wooden chair by the hearth, his hands folded loosely, his head slightly bowed as he listened, not just to the room, but to the memory of what they had felt earlier, replaying it in his mind the way he once replayed distant signals during long nights overseas, searching for patterns, for meaning, for anything that might reveal what others could not see. And the more he thought about it, the clearer one truth became: whatever lay beneath that ground was not random. It had structure, it had intent, and that meant it had a story, and stories, Ethan knew, always left traces if you were patient enough to follow them. And he exhaled slowly, the decision forming not as a question, but as a next step that felt inevitable. And without speaking he stood, his hand brushing lightly against the back of the chair before finding Rex's shoulder, and the dog rose instantly, not startled, not unsure, but ready, as if he'd been waiting for this moment without needing to be told it was coming. And together they stepped out into the night once more, the air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of water and the distant rustle of trees settling into darkness. And the path felt familiar beneath their feet, but the purpose behind their steps had changed, because this time they were not just observing, they were seeking. And when they reached the clearing, Ethan paused at the edge, listening first, always listening. And there it was again, that faint, steady pulse beneath the ground, consistent as a heartbeat, quiet but undeniable. And he stepped forward slowly, guided by Rex's subtle movements, until they stood once more over that unseen boundary. And this time Ethan did not kneel immediately. Instead he reached into the small pack slung over his shoulder, his fingers moving with practiced familiarity until they found a compact folding tool. he had carried since long before the war had changed his life. A simple thing, nothing special, but reliable, and he crouched carefully, pressing the tool into the earth with measured pressure, not forcing, not digging aggressively, but testing, feeling the resistance beneath the surface, and the soil gave slightly, softer than he expected in that exact spot, as if it had been disturbed at some point long ago and never fully settled back into its natural state, and Rex shifted closer, his body aligned with Ethan's movements, his nose hovering just above, the ground as if tracking something that extended beyond what could be touched, and Ethan worked slowly, removing small amounts of soil at a time, his movements deliberate, patient, guided more by sensation than by any visual reference, and with each inch the ground seemed to reveal more, not in sudden discovery, but in subtle changes, the texture shifting, the density altering, until finally his tool struck something firmer. Not stone, not root, but something smoother, something that did not belong to the natural layering of earth. And Ethan stopped immediately, his breath stilling for a moment as his fingers replaced the tool, brushing carefully over the surface, and there it was, unmistakable now, a solid structure just beneath the soil, flat, even shaped by intention rather than time, and his pulse slowed, not from fear, but from recognition, because this was no longer just a sensation, this was confirmation. And beside him, Rex let out a low, steady exhale, his body relaxing, just slightly as if acknowledging that they had found what they were meant to find, and Ethan traced the edge of the surface with his fingertips, mapping its outline in his mind, feeling where it extended, where it stopped, and it was not large, perhaps a few feet across, but precise, contained, almost as if it had been placed there carefully, deliberately, and covered just enough to remain hidden until someone chose to look for it in the right way. And Ethan sat back slowly, the weight of the moment settling in, because whatever this was, it had not been meant for everyone. It had waited quietly beneath layers of time and silence until now, until them, and he tilted his head slightly, listening again, not to the surface, but to the deeper rhythm beneath, and the pulse was still there, steady, unchanged, as if the presence below was aware, not in a way that could be explained, but in a way that could be felt. And Ethan spoke softly, his voice carrying a quiet respect. "We found you," he said, not as a claim, but as an acknowledgement, and Rex remained beside him, still and steady, his presence unwavering, as if confirming that some discoveries are not about uncovering something hidden, but about arriving at the moment when it chooses to be found. The earth did not resist him, but it did not give everything away either, and Ethan remained crouched beside that hidden surface for a long moment, his fingers resting lightly against it, as if waiting for something more than shape or texture, something deeper, something that could not be measured with tools alone, and the faint pulse beneath it continued, steady and patient, like a rhythm that had no need to rush, and Rex stood close, his body angled toward the exact center of that buried structure, his focus unwavering, as if the place itself had anchored his attention in a way nothing else could. And Ethan slowly brushed away more soil with his hands, careful, deliberate, not uncovering recklessly, but revealing with respect, and inch by inch the outline became clearer beneath his touch, smooth edges, precise corners, something crafted rather than formed. And as more of it emerged, the air around them seemed to shift again, not dramatically, but subtly, as if the act of uncovering had changed the balance of something unseen. And Ethan paused, his hands stilling against the surface, his head tilting slightly as he listened beyond the obvious, beyond the surface sounds of wind and water. And there it was again, the pulse, but closer now, clearer, no longer distant. And for the first time it felt less like something beneath the ground and more like something within the structure itself, contained, centered, and that realization settled into him with a quiet weight. Because whatever this was, it was not just buried, it was holding something, and Rex shifted slightly, lowering himself until his chest was nearly against the ground, his nose hovering just inches above the exposed surface, and his breathing slowed, steady, controlled, as if he was aligning himself with that same rhythm. And Ethan reached forward again, tracing along the edge until his fingers found a slight indentation, a seam where the surface met something else, and he followed it carefully, mapping it in his mind until the shape became undeniable, a lid, a covering, something designed to be opened, and he exhaled slowly, the understanding settling deeper now, because this was not an accident. This was not random earth shifting or natural formation. This had been placed here, intentionally, deliberately, and left to wait. And the question was not just what it held, but who had left it and why. And Ethan sat back slightly, his hand resting on his knee as he considered, not rushing, not forcing the moment, because whatever lay beneath that lid had already waited long enough. And it did not need impatience now. And Rex lifted his head just slightly, his ears turning toward Ethan as if sensing the shift in his thinking, the quiet pause before the next step. And Ethan reached out again, his fingers finding the edge of the lid once more, testing it gently, applying just enough pressure to feel how it responded. It did not move at first, not because it was locked, but because time had settled it into place, layers of earth and seasons pressing it down into stillness. And Ethan adjusted his grip, his movements careful but firm, and with a slow, steady motion, the lid shifted just slightly, enough to break the seal that had held it closed, and the sound it made was soft, almost like a sigh, as if the earth itself had exhaled after holding something in for far too long. And Rex immediately lifted his head higher, his ears fully forward now, his focus sharpening, and Ethan paused again, his hand resting against the partially loosened lid, because something had changed, not in the ground, not in the air, but in the feeling itself. The pulse beneath had shifted, not stronger, not weaker, but different, as if aware that the boundary had been disturbed, and Ethan remained still, listening, allowing that change to settle, to reveal itself without interference. And for a moment, there was only silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to make you question whether anything will happen at all, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rhythm beneath resumed, steady once more, but now it felt closer, more present, as if whatever lay inside had acknowledged the movement above, and Ethan's fingers tightened slightly on the edge, not in fear, but in focus, because this was the moment where curiosity meets consequence, where discovery begins to reveal its weight, and beside him Rex remained perfectly still, not retreating, not advancing, simply holding his position as if standing guard over the threshold between what was known and what was about to be uncovered. And Ethan drew in a slow breath, grounding himself in the present, in the steady presence of the dog beside him, in the quiet certainty that whatever came next, he would not face it alone. And with that, he began to lift the lid just a little more, not fully, not yet, but enough to let the unseen become something closer to being known, because sometimes the truth does not reveal itself all at once. It opens slowly, waiting for the one who finds it to be ready to understand what it has been holding all along. The lid did not open with resistance, but with a quiet willingness, as if whatever had been waiting beneath it had already decided that this moment was the right one. And Ethan lifted it slowly, carefully, his movements measured not by sight, but by the subtle feedback in his hands, the slight shift in weight, the gentle release of pressure as the seal broke further, and a faint breath of cool air rose from below, carrying with it a scent unlike the surrounding earth, cleaner somehow, untouched by time and the way the soil above had been shaped by seasons and weather. And Rex leaned forward immediately, not lunging, not rushing, but lowering his head with deliberate focus, his ears high, his body still except for the steady rhythm of his breathing. And Ethan paused once the lid was open enough to create a narrow space, just a few inches, enough for the unseen to begin revealing itself through sensation rather than sight. And he tilted his head slightly, listening, waiting, in the pulse that had guided them. He was no longer distant at all. It was right there now, close, steady, almost centered beneath the opening, and it no longer felt like something hidden in the ground. It felt contained, protected, held within whatever structure lay below, and Ethan slowly lowered one hand into the opening, not reaching blindly, but exploring with care, his fingers brushing against the inner surface first, smooth, cool, crafted, and then deeper, until they hovered over something else, something that carried that same faint rhythm. And he stopped just short of touching it, his breath steady but slower now, because the moment held a kind of weight that did not demand action, only awareness, and Rex let out a soft, low exhale, not a warning, not a signal to retreat, but something closer to recognition, as if what lay below was not unknown to him in the way it was to Ethan, but familiar in a way that could not be explained through training or memory alone. And Ethan felt that, not through words, but through the quiet alignment of their presence. The way Rex did not pull him back, did not hesitate, but remained steady, grounded, as if standing at the edge of something important rather than something dangerous. And Ethan finally allowed his fingers to move the last inch forward, until they made contact with the object beneath. And it was not cold like stone, not rough like buried wood, but smooth, firm, and faintly warm, carrying a subtle vibration that matched the rhythm they had followed all along. And the moment his skin met it, the pulse seemed to shift slightly, not stronger, not weaker, but aware, as if the connection itself had been acknowledged. And Ethan inhaled slowly, his mind quieting, because whatever this was, it was not something to be understood through logic alone. It required something else, something deeper, something closer to trust. And he let his fingers rest there for a moment, not pressing, not testing, just feeling, allowing the sensation to settle, to become familiar. And the rhythm beneath his hand steadied into something almost comforting, not mechanical, not chaotic, but consistent, like a heartbeat that had no urgency, no distress, only presence. And Rex lowered himself fully now, his chest touching the ground beside the opening, his head angled so that his gaze remained fixed on the space where Ethan's hand had disappeared, and his body relaxed in a way it had not since they first arrived at the cabin, as if whatever tension he had carried was now resolved. Not because the unknown had disappeared, but because it had been understood. And Ethan slowly withdrew his hand, his fingers lingering at the edge of the opening before returning to rest lightly on the lid. And he sat back slightly, processing not what he had found, but how it had felt, because that was what mattered most, the absence of threat, the presence of something steady, something intentional, something that did not belong to fear. And he tilted his head again, listening, and the pulse remained unchanged, as if the brief contact had not disturbed it but confirmed it. And he spoke quietly, his voice calm, reflective. "You are not hidden," he said, almost as if correcting his earlier thoughts. "You were waiting." And Rex exhaled softly, a quiet sound that seemed to agree. And for a moment the world felt still around them, the trees, the creek, the wind, everything settling into a kind of quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted, not in the ground, not in the air, but in understanding. And Ethan closed his fingers gently over the edge of the lid once more, not to seal it away, but to rest there, as if holding the space between what had been unknown and what was now beginning to be understood. Because sometimes the most important discoveries are not about what is found, but about the moment when something chooses to reveal itself, and a willingness to meet it without fear. The moment did not end when Ethan pulled his hand back. It lingered in the air between them, in the quiet space above the opening, in the steady rhythm that continued beneath the surface, as if nothing had been disturbed, and yet everything had changed. And Ethan remained there, crouched beside the partially open structure, his fingers resting lightly on the edge, as if the connection had not fully broken, as if part of him was still listening through touch alone. And Rex did not move away, did not shift his focus, his presence anchored beside Ethan with a calm certainty that felt deeper than instinct. And for a long while neither of them acted, neither of them rushed to uncover more, because the discovery itself was not asking for speed, it was asking for understanding. And Ethan slowly exhaled, his thoughts moving not toward what to do next, but toward what this meant, because whatever they had found was not accidental, it was not random. It had been placed, protected, and left to wait, and the fact that it responded not with resistance, but with a steady, almost welcoming rhythm told him something important, something that did not come from training or logic, but from the quiet place within him that had learned to trust what could not be seen. And he tilted his head slightly, listening again, and this time the pulse felt different, not in strength, not in speed, but in clarity, as if now that the barrier had been opened, Even partially, the connection between what was below and what was above had become more direct, more present. And Ethan spoke softly, his voice steady, almost reflective. "You are not alone down there," he said, not as a question, but as a realization, because the rhythm did not feel empty. It did not feel mechanical. It felt sustained, like something that had been holding itself together for a very long time, waiting for contact, waiting for acknowledgement. And Rex shifted slightly at that, his ears flicking once, his body relaxing, just enough to show that whatever tension had once defined him was now replaced with something quieter, something closer to trust. And Ethan slowly reached down again, not as cautiously this time, but with a calm intention, his hand finding the opening and moving inside until his fingers once again touched that same surface, that same steady vibration. And this time he did not pull back immediately. He let his hand rest there longer, allowing the sensation to settle deeper, to become familiar rather than foreign. And as he did, something unexpected happened, not in the object itself, but in his perception of it, because the rhythm beneath his hand began to feel less like something separate and more like something connected. Not physically, but in awareness, as if the space between him and what lay beneath had narrowed in a way that did not require sight or explanation. And he inhaled slowly, his brow softening as the tension he had not even realized he was carrying began to ease. And beside him, Rex lowered his head fully now, resting his chin on the ground. Near the opening, his body completely still, his breathing slow and even, as if he too had reached a point of understanding that required no further reaction. And Ethan spoke again, quieter this time, almost like a whisper meant not for the air, but for whatever lay below. "We are here," he said, and the words carried no demand, no expectation, only presence. And the pulse beneath his hand remained steady, unchanged, but somehow it felt acknowledged, as if the act of being found had fulfilled something that had been waiting for far longer than Ethan could comprehend. And time passed without measure, the kind of time that does not need to be counted, where moments stretch and settle without urgency. And eventually Ethan withdrew his hand once more, not because he felt the need to, but because the connection had already been made, and he rested his palm gently on the edge of the lid, his fingers tracing its surface with a quiet familiarity. And he nodded slightly, not to Rex, not to himself, but to the understanding that had formed between them and whatever lay beneath. And as he carefully lowered the lid back into place, not sealing it completely, but resting it gently, as if leaving the space open in a way that could be returned to, the air around them seemed to settle again. The subtle shift easing back into the natural rhythm of the night, and Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears relaxing, his focus no longer fixed in the same intense way, as if the moment had reached its natural pause, not an end, but a point of rest. And Ethan stood slowly, his hand finding Rex's shoulder once more, grounding himself in the steady presence that had led him here. And as they turned back toward the cabin, the path felt different, not because it had changed, but because Ethan had, because the world was no longer something he moved through alone, guided only by memory and caution. It was something shared now, something revealed in layers, through trust, through patience, through the quiet understanding that not everything hidden is meant to stay that way forever. And as they walked, the faint sound of the creek carried through the trees, steady and continuous, like a reminder that some things have always been there, waiting not for someone to see them, but for someone to finally listen. The cabin felt quieter when they returned, not because the world outside had changed, but because something within Ethan had settled into a new kind of awareness, the kind that does not fade once it has been found. And he moved through the familiar space with a slower rhythm, his steps guided not just by memory now, but by a deeper sense of presence, as if every surface, every sound, every small shift in the air carried meaning that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. And Rex followed, close beside him, not leading as firmly as before, but staying aligned, his body relaxed yet attentive, as if the urgency that had once driven his movements had softened into something steadier, something more certain. And Ethan paused near the hearth, his hand resting lightly against the wooden mantel as he listened, not for the pulse beneath the ground this time, but for the echo of it within himself, the memory of that steady rhythm that had felt so alive, so present, and for a moment he stood there in silence, allowing that memory to settle deeper, to become part of the way he understood the world around him. And then he spoke quietly, not to the room, but to the presence beside him. It was not just something buried, he said, his voice calm, thoughtful. It was something waiting to be found by the right kind of listening. And Rex shifted slightly, his tail brushing once against the floor, a small movement that carried agreement without needing to be seen, and Ethan turned, his head toward the back wall again, toward the direction of the creek. And even from here, even through the layers of wooden distance, he could almost feel it, not as clearly as before, but enough to know that it remained steady, patient, unchanged by their discovery, as if its purpose had never been to hide, but simply to exist until someone understood how to reach it, and the realization did not bring urgency. It brought calm, because there was nothing to chase, nothing to force, only something to return to when the moment asked for it. And the evening passed quietly, the fire crackling low, the air settling into that familiar stillness that no longer felt empty. And Rex lay near the doorway once more, his breathing slow, his posture relaxed. Yet his ears still carried that subtle readiness, as if even in rest he remained connected to something beyond the walls of the cabin. And Ethan sat again in the wooden chair, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his head slightly bowed, not in fatigue, but in reflection, because the pieces of the story were beginning to form, not fully, not clearly, but enough to suggest that what they had found was not just an object, not just a structure, but something placed with intention, something that carried purpose beyond its physical presence. And he thought back to the way the soil had felt, the way the edges had been precise, the way the lid had opened not with resistance but with quiet ease, and the way the pulse had responded not with disturbance, but with steady continuation. And all of it pointed to one thing, that whatever lay beneath the ground had not been abandoned, it had been preserved. And that thought settled into him with a quiet weight, because preservation meant value, not in the way people often think of value, not in money or possession, but in meaning, in purpose, in something worth protecting across time. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his fingers tracing the worn armrest of the chair as he considered, and beside him Rex shifted again, lifting his head just enough to listen, his ears angling toward the back of the cabin as they had done so many times before. And Ethan noticed immediately, not because of sight, but because of the change in the air, the subtle shift in attention that passed between them like an unspoken signal. And he tilted his head, listening deeper, and there it was, faint but unmistakable, the pulse again, not distant now, not hidden beneath layers of earth, but clearer, closer, as if the connection between them and what lay beneath had grown stronger since the moment of contact. And Ethan stood slowly, his hand finding Rex's shoulder once more, grounding himself in that steady presence, and this time there was no hesitation, no pause to consider whether they should go, because the answer was already there, already understood, and together they moved toward the door once more, stepping into the cool night air where the world waited in quiet anticipation, and the path toward the creek felt almost familiar now, not just in distance, but in purpose, as if each step was part of something that had already begun long before they arrived. And as they walked, the pulse beneath the ground seemed to align with their movement, not leading them, not guiding them, but meeting them, as if the space between them was no longer divided by distance or soil, but connected through something far more subtle, something that did not require sight to follow, only the willingness to trust what could be felt but not seen. And Ethan exhaled softly, a faint smile touching his lips as the understanding settled deeper, because whatever this was, whatever they had uncovered, it was not just waiting to be found, it was waiting to be understood, and perhaps in its own quiet way, it had already chosen them to do exactly that. The night welcomed them again without resistance, as if the path had already accepted their return long before they stepped outside. And Ethan moved with a steadier pace this time, not cautious in the way of uncertainty, but deliberate in the way of someone who already understood where he was going. And Rex walked beside him with quiet precision, no longer needing to guide each step as firmly, because the connection between them had deepened into something that required less direction and more presence. And as they reached the clearing, the air felt different once more, not heavier, not lighter, but clearer, as if whatever had been waiting beneath the ground had grown more certain of their arrival. And Ethan paused at the edge, tilting his head slightly as he listened, and the pulse was there immediately, no longer faint, no longer distant, but steady and unmistakable, aligned with the space before them, as if calling not for attention, but for continuation. And he stepped forward, without hesitation, his hand already reaching toward the familiar edge of the lid, and Rex lowered himself beside it, his posture calm, his breathing even, his presence steady as a quiet anchor in the shifting unknown. And Ethan knelt once more, his fingers brushing the surface before finding the edge, and this time the lid lifted more easily, as if whatever resistance had once held it in place had fully released, and the cool air from below rose again, carrying that same clean, untouched scent. And Ethan opened it further than before, not fully, but enough to allow more space, more presence. And he lowered his hand once more into the opening, his fingers finding the object beneath with greater confidence now. And the moment his skin made contact, the pulse responded, not changing in speed or strength, but in clarity, as if the connection had become more direct, more understood. And Ethan let his hand rest there, his breathing slow, his mind quiet, because this was no longer about discovery. It was about understanding. And as he focused on the sensation, something else began to emerge, not through sight, not through sound, but through awareness, a subtle shift in perception that did not form images, but impressions, like echoes of something long past, something preserved within the rhythm itself. And he felt it not as memory, but as presence, as if the object beneath his hand carried more than structure, more than material. It carried something of what it had once been connected to, something of purpose. And Ethan's brow softened, not in confusion, but in recognition, because this was not unfamiliar to him. Not entirely. There had been moments before in places far from here where silence had carried meaning deeper than words, where patterns had revealed truths that could not be seen. And this felt the same, not in detail, but in essence. And beside him Rex remained completely still, his body aligned with the opening, his ears relaxed but attentive, as if he too was experiencing something beyond the surface, something that required no reaction, only presence. And Ethan spoke softly, his voice calm, almost reverent. "You were not just placed here," he said, his words forming slowly as the understanding settled. "You were left with intention." And the pulse beneath his hand continued, steady, unchanged, but somehow it felt as though the space around it had shifted, as if the acknowledgement itself had deepened the connection. And Ethan withdrew his hand slowly, not breaking the contact abruptly, but allowing it to fade naturally, and he rested his palm on the edge once more, his fingers tracing the surface with quiet familiarity. And for a moment he said nothing, because some realizations do not need to be spoken, they exist fully in the understanding itself. And he tilted his head slightly, listening again, and this time the rhythm seemed to extend beyond the object, beyond the ground, as if it had always been part of something larger, something connected to the land, to the space, to the quiet flow of time itself. And Ethan exhaled softly, a faint smile touching his lips, not from certainty, but from acceptance, because whatever this was, whatever it had been meant to hold or protect, it was not something to be taken, not something to be claimed. It was something to be understood, to be respected, and perhaps to be shared in the right way, at the right time. And Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears shifting once as if sensing the change in Ethan's thoughts, the quiet shift from discovery to purpose. And Ethan nodded faintly, not to the dog, but to the moment itself, because he knew now that this was not the end of what they had found. It was only the beginning of what it meant. And as he gently lowered the lid again, leaving it resting just as before, not sealed, not hidden, but not fully exposed, he allowed the space to return to its quiet state, the pulse still there beneath, steady and patient. And he rose slowly, his hand finding Rex's shoulder once more, grounding himself in the presence that had led him here. And as they turned back toward the cabin, the night felt different again, not because anything had changed in the world around them, but because Ethan now carried a deeper understanding of what it meant to listen, to trust, and to recognize that sometimes the most important things are not the ones we see, but the ones that choose to reveal themselves only, to those who are willing to feel their truth. The night no longer felt like something separate from Ethan. It felt like something he was moving within, something that responded not to sight but to presence. And as he and Rex returned once more from the clearing, there was no urgency in their steps, no need to rush ahead or look back, because what had been found was no longer uncertain. It had become part of them, part of the way they understood the space around them. And inside the cabin, the air held a quiet warmth, the kind that does not just come from fire, but from stillness, from the absence of doubt. And Ethan paused just inside the doorway, his hand resting lightly on the frame as he listened. Not searching this time, not questioning, but simply allowing the world to exist as it was. And Rex stepped in beside him, his movements calm, his posture relaxed in a way that no one at the shelter would have believed possible, because the edge that had once defined him had softened into something steady, something grounded, as if the connection they had formed had given him a place to rest that he had not known before. And Ethan moved slowly toward the chair near the hearth, sitting down with a quiet exhale, his hands resting loosely as his thoughts settled into a new rhythm, one that no longer revolved around what they had found, but what it meant. And that meaning did not come as a single answer. It came in layers, in realizations that unfolded slowly, like the pulse beneath the ground that had never rushed, had never forced itself to be understood. And Ethan leaned his head back slightly, listening, and even here, even within the walls of the cabin, he could still sense it faintly, not as a sound, not as a vibration he could measure, but as a presence that had become familiar, something that no longer needed to be located because it had already been acknowledged. And he spoke softly, his voice calm, almost reflective. It was never hidden from the world, he said, only from those who could not listen. And Rex shifted slightly, his tail brushing once against the wooden floor, a quiet response that carried understanding rather than curiosity. And Ethan turned his head slightly toward him, a faint smile touching his lips, because there was no longer a need to explain anything, not to Rex, not to himself, because the truth of it had already settled where it needed to be. And time passed gently, the fire crackling low, the night deepening outside. And yet nothing felt heavy, nothing felt uncertain, because the question had changed. It was no longer about what they would find, but about what they would do with it. And Ethan knew, not through logic, but through the same quiet certainty that had guided him since the moment he first reached out his hand at the shelter, that whatever lay beneath the ground was not meant to be taken, not meant to be removed from where it rested. It was meant to remain, to continue its quiet existence, to be honored rather than claimed. And that understanding brought with it a kind of peace that he had not felt in a long time, a sense that not everything needed to be solved, not everything needed to be owned. Some things simply needed to be witnessed, to be respected. And Rex rose slowly from his place near the doorway, moving toward Ethan with calm, deliberate steps, and he rested his head gently against Ethan's knee, a simple gesture, but one that carried everything that had passed between them, the trust, the understanding, the quiet alignment that had formed without words. And Ethan lowered his hand, resting it against Rex's head, his fingers moving slowly through the thick fur, grounding himself in that presence, in that connection that had become more than companionship, more than partnership. It had become something deeper, something that did not rely on sight or explanation, only on trust. And he spoke again, quieter this time. "You knew before I did," he said, and Rex remained still, his breathing steady, his presence unwavering, as if confirming what Ethan already understood, that sometimes the ones who cannot see are guided by those who can feel what others overlook, and that guidance is not about control, not about leading, but about trust, about knowing when to step forward and when to remain still. and outside the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the same quiet rhythm that had been there all along. And Ethan listened, not for answers, but for presence, for the continuation of something that no longer needed to be uncovered to be understood. And as the night settled fully around them, there was no sense of ending, no final conclusion, only a quiet continuation, because some stories do not end when something is found. They begin when it is finally understood, and in that understanding, Ethan realized that what had changed was not the world around him, but the way he moved through it, no longer searching for what he had lost, but listening for what had always been there, waiting patiently to be heard. Morning arrived without announcement, carried softly through the thin walls of the cabin in the form of cool air and distant water, and Ethan woke not because of sound, but because something inside him had already shifted before the day began, a quiet awareness that no longer waited for signals, but recognized them as part of something constant. And beside him Rex stirred gently, stretching once before settling into a calm stillness, his presence no longer alert in the way of watchfulness, but steady in the way of belonging. And Ethan sat up slowly, his hand resting instinctively on the dog's shoulder, grounding himself in the warmth that had become as familiar as breath itself. And for a moment he did not move, did not rise. He simply listened, not searching, not questioning, just allowing the world to exist around him as it was. And in that stillness he felt it again, faint but undeniable, the quiet rhythm beneath the earth near the creek, not calling, not demanding, but continuing, as it always had, as it always would. And Ethan smiled slightly, a small expression that carried something deeper than satisfaction, something closer to peace. Because he understood now that the discovery had never been about uncovering something hidden. It had been about learning how to listen in a way he had forgotten, or perhaps had never fully known. And he stood slowly, moving through the cabin with ease, his steps no longer measured by uncertainty, but by familiarity, and Rex followed without needing to lead, his body aligned naturally beside Ethan's, their movement now a shared rhythm rather than a guided one. And when they stepped outside, the morning air wrapped around them with a quiet clarity, the scent of pine and water drifting through the stillness. And the path toward the creek lay open before them, unchanged in form, but different in meaning. And Ethan paused for only a moment before walking forward, not out of curiosity this time, but out of something simpler, something more grounded. And as they reached the clearing, he did not kneel immediately, did not reach for the ground or the lid. He simply stood there, listening, feeling, acknowledging the presence beneath without the need to touch it, because the connection had already been made, already understood. And Rex moved a few steps ahead, stopping near the spot where the structure lay hidden, his ears relaxed, his posture calm, no longer signaling urgency, only quiet awareness. And Ethan followed, stopping just beside him, his head tilted slightly as he listened to the rhythm beneath the earth, steady, unchanged. And he spoke softly, not to the dog, not even fully to himself, but to the moment. "You do not need to be open to be known," he said, and the words settled into the air with a quiet certainty, because he understood now that what lay beneath was not meant to be taken, not meant to be disturbed beyond what had already been revealed. It had served its purpose simply by being found, by being acknowledged, and that was enough. And Rex lowered himself gently onto the ground beside the hidden space, his chin resting lightly, as if in quiet respect. And Ethan remained standing for a moment longer before turning away, not in dismissal, but in completion, because the need to return again and again had faded, replaced by the understanding that some things are not meant to be revisited constantly, but carried forward quietly, as part of the way one sees the world. And as they walked back toward the cabin, the forest seemed different, not because it had changed, but because Ethan had the sound sharper, the air clearer, the silence fuller, and he no longer felt the absence of sight as something missing, but as something that had made space for something else, something deeper, something that allowed him to hear what others passed by without noticing. And beside him Rex moved with the same steady calm, no longer the dog others had feared, no longer defined by what had once been misunderstood, but simply present, simply aligned, and Ethan reached down briefly, his hand brushing against the dog's back in a gesture that needed no explanation, and they continued on, step by step, back toward the small cabin that now felt less like a place of solitude and more like a place of quiet understanding. And as the day unfolded around them, nothing extraordinary happened. No sudden revelations, no dramatic changes, only the steady continuation of life. But beneath it all, there remained that quiet rhythm, that presence that had once been hidden and was now simply known. And Ethan carried it with him not as a mystery to solve, but as a reminder that sometimes the most important things are not the ones we uncover, but the ones that teach us how to listen. And perhaps, in that listening, we find not just what was waiting beneath the surface, but what has always been waiting within ourselves.